And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 64.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, at the start of your episode last week, I burst out laughing because we obviously were reading and listening to similar things at the same time. Now, this is an article that popped up in my news feed from The Guardian online. It's a British newspaper. I don't even know if you can still get the hard copy newspaper anymore. It's The Guardian, so probably, but I know some of them have moved to online only. But anyway, an article popped up in my feed by somebody called Annalisa Barbieri, and the article was entitled, "Why I'm Glad That I'm an Overthinker." And this immediately resonated with me because I think I would identify as an overthinker myself. So I read the article. And just as a quick aside, Annalisa Barbieri, I haven't come across her before, but she's obviously a journalist, but she also has a new podcast series called Conversations with Annalisa Barbieri. Haven't given it a listen to yet, but I plan to. Something that she says at the beginning of the article is, people say I'm an overthinker, but for me, it is they who underthink. I just think. And she talks about her overthinking as going through all the possibilities and eventualities of a situation. And it reminded me quite a lot of Gretchen Rubin's Questioner. It feels like it has some similarities. People who are questioners, who are quite often researchers, who really like to think things through and potentially overthink things. So overthinkers often told to stop overthinking it, just do it. And questioners, you would often hear somebody saying something like, why do you have to question everything? Why can't you just accept that it is so? Do you see what I mean? They kind of feel a little bit similar to me. Mm-hmm. And she talks about where her overthinking habit started, or where she thinks it did, and that's in childhood, of course. And she said that in her family household, emotions were not really discussed, or they got bottled up and then exploded at seemingly random times. So she learnt to sit back and observe and take the temperature of a room, watch out for small movements, change in tone, language, and work out what was going on with the people around her that way. And she could quite often tell what somebody was going to say or do before they did it, as part of this quiet observation. Now that she has her own family, that's something they often say to her. You must be a mind reader. How did you know I was going to do that? But all it is actually is that she's very, very good at reading people, and this overthinking and thinking through all the different eventualities. And so she quite often gets there before you do. She then went on to have a military career where overthinking was part of the job description. So it just compounded this habit of hers. And she says overthinking can be exhausting. She says that she has to set herself some boundaries and time off to avoid overthinking burnout. And she also has to be very careful not to end up doing other people's thinking for them. And she asked somebody called Susanna Abs, who's a psychoanalyst, what the distinction is between perseverating and reflecting. Susanna says it's about whether you are going over and over something in your mind without a resolution, or whether you're able to sit back, replay something, and learn something useful from it. In an action-focused world, being a thinker isn't necessarily a bad thing, but ruminating in a way that doesn't lead anywhere may be a sign of anxiety. The difference is between being preoccupied but powerless and overthinking leading to something being put to bed. The former is not great, and that's where you need to look at what's causing your anxiety.
It reminds me of what we talked about last week with John Acuff's stuff on overthinking and the soundtrack and kind of paying attention if the thoughts that you keep having, are they moving you forward? Are they helping you feel resolution, like you just said from Susanna's definition, or are they keeping you feeling stifled, stuck, fearful? Then that is rumination, or it's playing that soundtrack that's not going to help. And funnily enough, right before you and I met today, I was listening to a book on stress. And this was the last thing they talked about before I came inside about ruminating. And they talked about it's kind of, if you think about ruminants, like thinking about a cow chews its food, swallows it, regurgitates it, chews it again, swallows it. And that feeds the amygdala's anxiety response. So it's fascinating to me how these article you read, podcast I listened to, and now book I'm listening to, how they're all just dovetailing.
And of course, it was the last thing in the list of 6 things that we could learn from our hunter-gatherer ancestors that Stephen Ilardi talked about, was how to deal with rumination. So yes, I think everyone agrees that that's something that is a problem. So even if you are an overthinker, working out this root cause can take time to do. And she says that she keeps drilling down on details until she starts to feel upset or defensive. And then she feels like she's getting to that root cause behind the overthinking and the anxiety side of it. And she says a question that can help with working out what these root causes are is, what needs to change to make me feel better? And she said that she's found that's a good way of digging into what's at the root. On the whole, though, she says that she loves being an overthinker. To her, it's very enriching. And she talks about this rich mental world that she has in her head. And she doesn't try to fight it, but rather embraces it and the benefits that it brings her. But she says there are times when it can become a bit much, and she has some practical tips to help. The overriding one, though, is to try and avoid spending too much time with underthinkers, because you will end up thinking not just for yourself, but for them too. And I notice you're smiling, and this straight away to me was, wow, that sounds familiar. We've had conversations about this, haven't we, where you've warned me not to start Googling and try to solve people's problems for them. So I definitely think I fall into this, sometimes the problematic behaviors of an overthinker. So some of her tips that she's found can help when the overthinking becomes a bit too much. The first one is yoga. And she says that poses that take a lot of focus, think of some of the poses where you're standing on one leg. She says they show up the overthinkers because they struggle a bit with those. The point being that you need to calm your mind and focus on what you're doing. And it brought to mind the standing on one leg episode. And I found that focusing heavily on breathing and slowing and calming my breathing really helped with the eyes closed part of the exercise. So I can see that, and I can see how also that calming your mind can be very difficult if you tend to be an overthinker. And she also mentions alternate nostril breathing, because apparently it helps balance the emotional and logical sides of the brain. And that's something that I've only tried a couple of times, but maybe it would be worth doing a bit more regularly. The second tip is not to try to clear your mind. Instead, opt for a soft focus type exercise, something like counting back in threes from 100 or staring into the distance aimlessly, preferably outside. So you're kind of this soft focus on something, but not acutely, just to try and calm your mind down a little bit. And in the same vein, repetitive tasks. something like running or knitting. Reasonably mindless, but absorbing and requiring of some focus at least. The fourth one is if you start to get overwhelmed, shorten your focus to the next 5 minutes. What do I need right now is a good question to ask yourself, and then concentrate on that. And she says in particular, grounding exercises can help. What can I see around me right now? What can I hear right now? Feel beneath my feet. And I certainly find that especially in the summer, I prefer to walk barefoot, certainly all around the house and in the garden. It's a bit difficult when there's building work going on, but otherwise I try and keep everything so that I can mostly walk barefoot. And I tend to, when you get to the beach and there's the wet sand, it's lovely to walk barefoot. I quite often in the park walk barefoot on the grass. And I know you're a firm believer in that, aren't you? How beneficial grounding can be. And I certainly feel that. I can feel a soothing quality of having your bare feet on the ground. And the fifth tip, she says that overthinking can release adrenaline. So it's really good to have something you can do to release that. And something that needs minimal planning. She jokes, not something like bungee jumping. That's not good for an overthinker. And her final top tip is, guess what? Cold showers. She says starting slow but building up to 2 to 3 minutes in temperatures less than about 15 degrees centigrade, which I looked up is 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And she says it's a really good way to bring your focus sharply back to the moment. And I can testify to that. As you know, I prefer to do it in the sea. But actually what I have been doing, especially when the weather's been really warm, is to have a cold shower in the evening before I go to bed. And I found that, and I've tried this before doing the cold showers and haven't been able to tolerate it. But it's funny how after swimming in the sea, I've obviously acclimatized a bit, even though the water's quite warm at the moment. I've got a much higher tolerance for cold water, and I can take cold showers now. So I've been doing that to cool down, but it definitely brings your focus into the moment. You really struggle to be anything but mindful when cold water is involved.
And to make that something that you could do in situations where obviously, in the middle of, you just read some work emails and you have another meeting, you can't necessarily go cold water swimming or take a cold shower at that time. But even something as little as submerging your face in cold water, splashing cold water in your face, you could do that same kind of response in a more simplified, applicable way. Unless you're someone who wears a lot of makeup and you couldn't do that in the middle of your day or something, but
But actually what you can do, and I can't remember who told me this in the first place, but if you need to cool down quickly, is to run your wrists under cold water. And that, I guess, because, the veins are near the surface there. I'm not sure what it is, but that does really help actually to cool you down. So yeah, if you can't splash your face, or if you can splash your face, but also hold your wrists under cold water, and that does help cool you down. It would serve that same purpose of bringing you into the moment if you needed to just get out of your head.
Another strategy I used to use with clients who were likely to self-injure. So moving into a little different area, but holding ice cubes. So again, that cold sensation, a little bit of a shock to the system, again, brings you back into the present, keeps you from perseverating and getting lost in the catastrophizing or reliving a trauma, bring you into a more grounded place with that.
What I really liked overall, though, about her article, and I know the episode you did, and you went into a lot more detail about overthinking and the different theories behind it and more tips on how to cope with it. But I just liked that she was coming from her own experience. I like it was quite a personal take on it. And I liked that the overall theme of it was that she actually liked being an overthinker and that she saw the benefits in it. And I think that's always, if you can take that kind of perspective, if you can work with something so ingrained like that and see the good sides of it, but be mindful of when it goes a bit off the rails and have some practical things in place that can help with those times, but actually see the real benefits of being somebody who does really take a situation and think everything through and find all the details. She was talking about experiences of where friends would say something like, well, who could have seen that coming? She said, well, I could. I could have told you that was a possibility because I'd already thought that through. I understand that needing to be prepared. I always look up on Google Maps to somewhere I'm going. I do it less. I know the area a bit better now. But for one, the GPS in my car doesn't really work very well, so I don't like to just rely on that. And I'm a dinosaur with my phone. I don't have things like that on my phone. I just use my mobile phone as a phone, really. So I can't rely on that. So when I'm having to go somewhere particular, I tend to look it up on Google Maps and usually draw myself a map with some of the other possibilities at the likely places that I might go wrong. But actually that works quite well for me because I've looked for markers on Google Maps. I've then reinforced that by drawing myself a little map. And then I'm reinforcing that when I'm out driving to wherever it is, because I'm looking out for those place markers that I saw on Google Maps and I put down on my own hand-drawn map. So actually that way of doing it, although it seems like it takes more time, and it does take more time, I feel that I'm getting to know the area better, and I need to do that less and less. Whereas if I was just relying on a GPS to tell me where to go, I wouldn't be kind of working things out as I was getting from A to B and really looking out for those place markers and getting to know the area quite as well. I don't know if you've ever struggled. If you've gone somewhere as a passenger and then you have to find the same place as a driver, I always struggle. Once I've driven it, and I've seen it for myself, I find it a lot easier to find things again.
Because generally we pay a lot less attention to
that's right.
what's happening when we're the passenger versus the driver. Absolutely. I also think the whole topic that you're discussing right now about the kind of overthinking being a good thing to have or ability to have, I think also relates to the whole thing around stress, and that the more perceived control we have in situations, the less our stress bothers us, and the less we perceive the stress as damaging or interfering, the less damaging or interfering it is. And so if I am an overthinker, but I see that as a strength and I see that as an important skill, I'm less likely to create stressful situations out of it. So being able to reframe some things, making them not just problematic aspects of personality that we want to avoid, but actually highlighting them as they serve us. How can we use them effectively?
Yes, because I can certainly see the skills that are involved, but it's just being aware of when it goes a bit too far and having things in place to stop those being a problem. Like as I mentioned earlier, the conversations we've had, and you've tried to get me aware of, do you really need to answer everyone's question? Somebody else can do it, or they could go and look it up on Google. It's not necessarily you who always has to try and overthink for underthinkers, as she talks about. So I think it was very useful for me to see the positives in it, but also to remember to be aware and to put up some boundaries like she has for herself, and being wary of, as she said, spending too much time with underthinkers, for example. But overall, yes, I see it far less now as being a problem. But certainly something that sometimes needs managing.
That's awesome. Well, I don't think we'll do a third week on this, but
No.
I am very struck and you and I discuss this often, how everything ends up weaving together. So even the strategies that she talked about, there are also strategies that if you came up with a list of stress relieving strategies, if you came up with a list of sleep enhancing strategies, these are behaviors that we keep identifying and bringing forward, that people are identifying for lots of positive benefits. And so they're not totally in isolation. It's not like, well, if you have this concern, go do this behavior. Lots of these behaviors are just positive things for the body and brain and the interaction of the two to work more effectively. So I'm always a little impressed how often it all circles back into itself.
Yeah, there's lots of overlap, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I might go and check out her podcast, because I certainly liked her article. And I might investigate alternative nostril breathing a bit more. Sounds like an easy thing I could try.
It'll be interesting to hear if you do any future episodes related to what you hear on her podcast. Because every now and then you and I, we branch out from our normal podcast that we always listen to, and we introduce a new topic. So I'll be interested to hear that.
Yes, we shall see. I don't know what her conversations are going to be like. Hopefully similar to the article. So yes, you're right. There might be more to come.
Well, I'm hoping that everyone can take this week's episode and last week's episode and kind of combine the thoughts and things that we've shared to think about how they manage overthinking and how they frame it for themselves. And I hope everyone has a great week.
Have a wonderful week.